Hey everybody, welcome back. Um, Three quick videos on the Pacific Theater. We're going to start with the attack on Pearl Harbor and the significance of it, as well as the failure of it. And then we're going to look at the Battle of Midway and the incredible importance of that, the major turning point in the war. And we're going to look at the island hopping campaign in general without looking too much at any one specific battle within the island hopping campaign. So let me do this video on Pearl Harbor, and I'm hoping that none of them are going to take very long, so we'll see how long this goes. Make sure you have a notebook and a pen, and you're ready to take notes. Because this is a video, you can stop it at any point if you feel like you need to take notes. There are a couple of points I'm going to highlight. You should write that down and pause a little bit so you have a chance to hit the pause button. But we're going to talk a little bit about how the United States, as you know, I'm sorry, I'm going to get my coffee. The United States, as you know, was trying to stay out of the war. We're trying to stay neutral. After the sinking of the Reuben James, that becomes just about impossible. We repeal the Neutrality Acts. We start openly helping the Allies, but we still don't join the war. And it's a while before President Roosevelt can convince Congress, really, that we're even in this in any way. And even then, Congress doesn't want to act. But on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese force our hand with a surprise and devastating attack on military bases in Hawaii and in the Philippines and in Guam. Now, interestingly enough, this is remembered as the attack on Pearl Harbor, when in fact, just as many Americans and American subjects are killed in attacks in the Philippines and Guam as are killed in Hawaii. America remembers this as the day of Pearl Harbor. We didn't really publicize the fact that we had this huge empire that included the Philippines and Guam very much. Many Americans didn't think of that as American territory, but somehow Pearl Harbor was. The question that you got to ask, and the question that we ask over and over again, is why? Why would Japan take on the United States when they didn't seemingly need to? Why get us into it? In the end, it was their undoing. It is the United States that pushes them back and captures Japanese territory and drops atomic bombs on them and forces them to surrender. They're winning everywhere they're fighting. The Greater East Asia Cooperation Zone, which they control, is dominated by their military, and they have invaded China and are doing very well in their invasion of China and other regions in Southeast Asia. They've taken over French Indochina, the Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia today. They've taken over that region. They've taken islands across the Pacific. Nobody seems to be able to stop them, and they're winning. So why kick the dragon? Right? Why get us into it? And this boils down to the fact that the way the Japanese perceived the situation was that the United States would eventually get into the war. And if the United States were to enter the war, they wanted to make sure that we were as weak as we possibly could be. So weak, in fact, that we couldn't hurt them. Pearl Harbor was important. It was really important. It was our biggest Pacific naval base since the Kingdom of Hawaii came under American control back in the 1800s. We had a substantial naval force there. And in 1941, the most important weapon in our arsenal, in anybody's arsenal, was the aircraft carrier. The naval forces, naval warfare was changing dramatically. Up until the 1940s, the most important weapon in any military was the battleship. It was huge. It could it could travel long distances. It could bring the war to anyone. Modern battleships could fire cannon that would fire miles away and with relative accuracy as well. Despite the rolling waves, these naval ships could be very powerful. But an aircraft carrier didn't just fire weapons 5 miles away. They could attack targets hundreds of miles away without anybody ever knowing where the aircraft carrier was. By launching their planes and attacking their targets with planes from the aircraft carriers, they become a far more potent weapon than the battleship ever was, and far more important to winning the war. The United States had only 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific, and they were all based at Pearl Harbor. So the Japanese determined that if the United States was going to get into the war anyway, they would launch this surprise attack to bring us into the war, but in the course of the surprise attack, destroy all 3 of our aircraft carriers and make it so that we would be a paper tiger, that we could not hurt them. It was so important to them to get the aircraft carriers that they, in fact, sent in a mini submarine with a very powerful radio into the harbor the night before the attack. The idea was this mini submarine would pop up, check to make sure the aircraft carriers were there, and if they weren't there, they were to radio back to the fleet, and the fleet would abort the mission. There's no sense hitting Pearl Harbor if you can't hit the aircraft carriers. And what's remarkable about Pearl Harbor and the attack that day is the aircraft carriers weren't there. For whatever reason, and there's a lot of debate about this, the aircraft carriers were all on maneuvers that day. They were out at sea, nowhere to be found by the Japanese. And when that mini sub popped up that morning, and it didn't pop up, its periscope did, and it searched around the harbor, it discovered no aircraft carriers. And they raised their antenna so that they could send a message back to the fleet to abort the mission, to call off the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this is one of the great twists of the war. Their radio failed. They were unable to get a message across. And because no message came in, attack or don't attack, the fleet continued its mission. They attacked, they did tremendous damage. One of their torpedo planes hit several torpedo planes from their fleet hit several destroyers. One of their planes launched a torpedo that hit the USS Arizona, and it hit it directly in an ammunition magazine and blew up the entire ship. Almost all the sailors aboard were killed. They hit on a Sunday morning. It was a surprise. Nobody saw it coming. Nobody knew we were even really under threat from the Japanese. They had declared war on the United States, but only a few minutes before the attack happened. And the representatives in Washington, D.C. handed over a note saying that the Empire of Japan was declaring war on the United States. So officially this is not a surprise attack, but the people at Pearl Harbor had not yet gotten the message that we were at war, and were not prepared for this. Very few U.S. planes got into the air to try and stop them. Many U.S. planes were destroyed on their airfield because they weren't camouflaged, they weren't in hangars, so the Japanese planes that showed up out of the sky could just destroy all the planes on the airfield before the pilots could get into them. A few pilots managed to get into the air, but our weaponry was outdated. The planes we had were no match for the Japanese Zero. It's the type of plane the Japanese fighter pilots used. The Zeros were the most maneuverable planes in the air at the time. Nobody had a plane as good. And so the pilots that did manage to get in the air were outgunned and outmaneuvered very quickly and shot down. Heroic though their efforts were, they were futile. The attack gets the United States into the war. We're not ready for it. We should have 5 more aircraft carriers in the Pacific at least, and tons more military forces, Army and naval. In the theater, we should have upgraded our Naval Air Corps dramatically and gotten faster, better, more maneuverable planes to fight. All of that's going to happen over the next couple of years. It happens far faster than anybody thought it could. But on the day of Pearl Harbor, we weren't ready. But on the day of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese did not get what they wanted. They wanted those aircraft carriers, and they didn't get any of them. And they proved to be the critical factor in the next two major battles, the Battle of the Coral Sea, which was the first time ever that two navies fought each other without ever actually firing their big guns. The navies fought entirely with planes from aircraft carriers. There's a lot of shooting that happened, but it wasn't the ships shooting at each other. It was airplanes shooting at the ships and ships shooting at the airplanes. That battle is indecisive, but it's historically important because the aircraft carriers are the battle. And then the Battle of Midway, which is the turning point, and we're going to talk about it in more detail in the next video, where those three aircraft carriers that we have prove to be the decisive weapon in turning the tide of the war. Even though Japan has many more aircraft carriers than we have, and a much larger navy in the Pacific, we're able, because they don't get those aircraft carriers that day, we're able to hold our own until we can increase our forces. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk again soon.